Today is Youth Sunday, if you haven't noticed, and I am pleased to have as our preacher today our Director of Family Ministries, Dan King. Dan?
Awesome, thank you. Hi. All right. The late great television host, author, producer, and Presbyterian minister Fred McFeely Rogers, you may also know him as Mr. Rogers, was known for saying, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping.'" I'd add to that statement and say that a very large majority of these helpers remain nameless, despite their incredible impact their actions may end up having. Today's New Testament reading in Acts tells us about the incredible conversion story of someone who went on to be one of the most influential figures in the early Christian church. And it includes a mention of one man most people barely notice, Ananias. So who is Ananias? Very little is written about him. We have this story, and we have a reference of him by Paul later in Acts 22, where Paul refers to him as a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by the Jews who lived there in Damascus. Historically speaking, 2nd and 3rd century theologian Hippolytus recognized Ananias as one of the 70 sent out two by Jesus, as recorded in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 10. But really, Ananias is just a footnote in the story of Paul's conversion. Even most commentaries, if you look this up on the passage, focus their attention on what's happening with the conversion of Saul to Paul, with little to no mention of Ananias. Ananias' story begins with a "Here I am, Lord" kind of statement, and it shows his willingness to do whatever God calls him to do. And that is until things get a little bit uncomfortable. God calls him to go pray for and minister to Saul. Think about that for a moment. This is a Saul who was well known for his work in turning Christ followers into martyrs. Saul was on his way to Damascus, which means that Ananias was likely on his list of targets. By today's standard, we'd consider Saul a terrorist. So Ananias' response turns into, "But Lord," isn't it interesting how we always try to argue with God and enlighten him on how things are, as if he wasn't already aware? And it's understandable, and our human tendency is towards avoidance of conflict and self-preservation. In fact, that's what the world today would actually encourage. Find the easier path. But the Christian life is never intended to be conflict or worry-free. Fortunately, Ananias didn't run from this mind-bogglingly troublesome situation. Rather, he walked the difficult path the Lord called him to take. As some of you know, we recently completed Lent Madness as a bracket-style competition for saints and other honored people throughout Christian history. The winner this year, as voted on by participants worldwide, is a man you also likely never heard of, Dr. Jose Gregorio Hernandez. Hernandez lived in Venezuela in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and rather than pursuing the priesthood, he chose to realize his devotion to God through the practice of medicine. And after receiving a grant from the government to study medicine in Paris, he returned with many offers to practice medicine in a comfortable, private practice. Instead, he chose the path of direct care, especially to the poor, which is why he is still known to this day as El Médico de los Pobres, the doctor to the poor. Even during the 1918 flu pandemic, he persisted with a tireless schedule, even entering the rooms of the sick despite his own fragile health. Hernandez had every opportunity to choose the comfortable path. Instead, he took the difficult path in order to have a greater impact for Christ through a life of self-sacrifice. And Jesus himself didn't come to put put on a crown and rule like we see earthly kings and rulers today leading from their high places. He came to be broken for us. He lived a life of self-sacrifice on behalf of others. And that's what it looks like to pick up your cross and to follow him. But sacrifice looks different for different people. You've also probably never heard of Edward Kimball. Edward Kimball was the Sunday school teacher for a bunch of hyper young boys. He set his focus on one particularly troublesome teenager who had little interest in God or religion. So he kept after him. And during a visit with this young man at his job in a shoe shop, he led the boy into a relationship with Christ. That boy was Dwight L. Moody, who eventually went on to become a great evangelist, publisher, teacher, and urban ministry pioneer. But the story doesn't stop there. D.L. Moody's responsible for the salvation of Wilbur Chapman, an evangelist who reached thousands. Chapman's evangelism reached professional baseball player Billy Sunday, who later became a pastor, impacting the life of a man named Mordecai Ham. And Ham became a traveling evangelist who is credited as being responsible for the salvation of one young man named Billy Graham. Billy Graham, the evangelist who preached to more than any other person who ever lived, including the Apostle Paul. And the whole chain of events goes back to a humble Sunday school teacher, Edward Kimball, who persisted in the hard work of ministering to difficult youth who didn't want anything to do with God. His name is a footnote in history, but his impact and his legacy are huge. And it'd be foolish of me to not take this opportunity to mention something, right? Today's Youth Sunday, right here in our church. And we appreciate all the incredible youth that we have here serving with us today. I also appreciate the service of all the helpers it takes to minister to these young people. Think about the impact that they're having. So this is where I ask you to consider how you might be able to help with our Sunday school and youth programs. Okay. Just think about that and be inspired by the example of Edward Kimball. Kimball's example is very much like the story of Ananias. The impact of his faithfulness is unquestionable. Paul's work has grown and shaped the church like few others throughout all of history. But Paul's story wouldn't have been Paul's story without the humble, selfless service of one man who followed God, even when it was uncomfortable. Could God have handled it without Ananias? Well, certainly. That's not how he works. God uses us to be the catalyst of his work in the world. When we pick up our cross to follow Jesus and we die to ourselves and we step obediently into his calling for us, no matter how big or how small, that's when we get to experience God in his fullness. Bobby Gross, the director of graduate and faculty ministries for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, writes in his book, Living the Christian Year, when Mother Teresa opened her first home for the dying poor, she entertained no ambitions for worldwide fame, no thoughts of meeting with presidents or accepting awards. Serving Christ would be its own award. Mother Teresa said, "You must not be afraid to say yes to Jesus, because there is no greater love than his love, and no greater joy than his joy." And Gross continues, in the pouring out of ourselves for Christ, we find ourselves empowered with his love and joy. This happens in our everyday lives, among our family and friends, in the familiar settings of our neighborhoods, schools, and places of work, in our domestic routines and leisure activities. Even our collect for today, for this week, speaks directly into the idea of self-sacrifice and the blessing we see in the midst of it. The prayer reads like this: "O God, whose blessed Son made himself known to his disciples in the breaking of bread." The breaking of bread. This is the breaking of his own body. Listen for the snap of the bread today during Eucharist. That sound, it still sends chills down my spine. It continues, open the eyes of our faith. Faith. That's a stepping into the uncertainty of what might come. And it continues, that we may behold him in all his redeeming work. So we get to see and experience the work of grace in the world around us. So may you find Christ in the breaking and in the self-sacrificial moments in your life as you step into the unknown that he calls you to. And in doing so, may you experience God and his redeeming grace in all of its fullness. Amen.